Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We'll get started momentarily. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you today to the AWFS Quarter 2 Economic Update webinar, titled in a fun way as Recession, Inflation, and War, oh my. And this is with economist Dr. Chris Kuehl from Armada Corporate Intelligence. A couple housekeeping tips. Please post any questions you have for Dr. Kuehl in the chat, and we will have question and answer time at the end, and so we can address those. And the session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with you after the session. It'll also be available on the AWFS YouTube channel. Dr. Chris Kuehl is a managing director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. He provides forecasts and strategic guidance for a wide variety of corporate clients around the world. He's the chief economist for several national and international organizations. We're really happy to have Dr. Kuehl with us. This is his second quarterly update. He was also at the AWFS Fair in 2021, and I know a lot of you folks know him already. So we're just thankful and looking forward to hearing the insight that he'll be sharing with us today. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now, Chris.
All right, very good. So now I just have to figure out how to get to my PowerPoint, which is always a challenge.
No worries.
Yeah, it's like every time I go someplace new, I end up with something exciting that I have to do that I've never had to do before. So let's see here. Here we go. I'm looking for my files. And it's giving me everything in the world I want, except let's see here. The joys of technology. Aren't we so glad that we have Zoom to worry about these days?
It's always an adventure. And
yeah,
that's the weekly updates. They keep it fun.
Yeah, exactly. So it's starting to come in. I'm halfway encouraged here. This is at least moving in the right direction.
Okay, good.
So, okay.
Well, while Chris is getting ready, I'd like to remind everyone about the flagship report. This is a weekly report that's produced by Chris and his team, and it's available for AWFS members. So at the end of this webinar, we'll have a link, and you can be sure that you're subscribed for that report. I know that it's been going for a couple months already, and people really enjoy it. Chris, my favorite section is that consider this at the end.
You are not alone in responding to that. So
Chris
it's
it's some fun stuff. So thank you.
Giving me all kinds of information I don't want. I tell you. All right, here we go. Maybe this will, hey, okay, we're in business now. So this is what happens when you take somebody of my generation and expose them to technology. You know, I mean, I grew up with a number 2 pencil and a yellow legal pad. So anything with more moving parts than a brick, and I'm out of my league. So here we are doing another update, and I figure this one will remain accurate for, like, I don't know, 24 hours. This seems the way it is these days with economics. I kind of changed the title around a little bit, simply because we're now in an environment where the geopolitical situations around the world are having as much or more of an impact on the economy than the other way around. I mean, usually you've got economics that drives a lot of the politics, and now it seems to be going the other way. You know, whether it is worrying about recession, worrying about inflation, worrying about supply chain, all these sorts of things that have been affecting every industry. There have been so many political drivers and so many political implications. So we'll kind of weave that in as we talk. I don't remember the last time that we communicated if I detailed some of my misspent youth, but I will remind you that in the 1980s, I was training to be a Soviet specialist. I was getting a degree in Soviet studies. I was learning Russian. I lived in Leningrad for a year. I was all set to be a spook, work for the agency, study the evil empire, the whole 9 yards, and then they have the poor taste to go out of business right in the middle of my PhD. So imagine my excitement when I'm suddenly relevant again. The Cold War is back, and all of a sudden, all of those prior trainings have come in handy because an awful lot of what's been affecting the country, affecting the world, has derived from the kind of situations we've been dealing with since the first of the year when Russia invaded Ukraine. So we'll talk a little bit about how it's playing into not only the world economy, but ours. Many of my presentations of late have kind of focused on what I would consider to be talking people off a ledge. And I don't mean to be a media basher. I'm really not in that frame of mind most of the time. But there's something about the way that the press and the media covers the economy that is a little disturbing because there always seems to be this desire to over dramatize, to make something that is complex over simple. And frankly, there's a little bit of the infotainment that comes into media these days where everything has to be made extreme, trying to figure out a way to get people to tune in. It is not that we are not dealing with inflation. Obviously, we are. It is not that we don't have a recession threat. Obviously, we do. The extent of either one of those threats is what's at issue. And what we can do about either one of those, that's what's a major concern. So if you look at some of the behaviors and some of the things that are indicating where we are, one of the things we look at pretty closely is gross domestic private investment. This is a very good indicator of whether or not you are heading into a recessionary pace, because this is going to measure what businesses are investing. This is basically their capital spending decisions. This is kind of exclusive of government spending. This is just the private sector. Whenever you see a dramatic decline in activity, you are pointing towards a recession. But it's up 18.7% year over year. It's 3% higher quarter over quarter. It's going in the peak direction, not down. Corporate investment has actually been increasing. Now, some of this increase is explained by the supply chain issue. It's been explained by even some of the anticipation of recessionary potential next year. A lot of what's driving private investment right now is inventory build. Companies are concerned about how broken the supply chain is, how their ability to make sure they have enough inventory on hand has been challenged, so they're buying more of it. I mean, a good example from just a few weeks ago, I was talking to a faucet manufacturer, and they had a huge contract. They were supposed to supply faucets to multifamily units all over the United States. They had everything they needed except the little button that goes on top of the faucet that says H or C. Now, you would think by now the consumer would know cold is on the right, hot is on the left, but without the little disc, they seemed to be confused and they could not sell the faucet until they got that part in. Well, the little buttons were stuck on some ship someplace or some port someplace coming out of China, and it was going to be months before they got it. In response to that supply chain breakdown, that company then made an order that was 10 times higher than they have ever bought before. And I talked to the guy and says, "Why did you do that?" And he says, "I am never going to be on the edge of losing a huge bid because I don't have a stupid hundredth of a cent piece of plastic." So once I figured out that I could get some of these things, I bought as many as I could get my hands on. And you're seeing a lot of companies load up on inventory, basically trying to protect themselves from that supply chain collapse. The other thing that's been driving a lot of investment has been the reaction to the labor shortage. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, but we're all well aware that we've had labor shortage issues for a number of years. I mean, this isn't new. This has been going on for at least a decade. Companies are now confronting one huge expenditure or another. They're either going to have to spend a great deal of money trying to find the people that they need and keeping the people that they have. Going to see a lot of wage increases, being hit with a lot of benefit increases, anything they have to do to hang on to or recruit new people, or they start finding ways to replace the people. And that's robotics, that's technology, that's automation. And companies are now investing heavily in that as well. So between the inventory build and investing more in technology and robotics, you're seeing a lot of activity. You're seeing a lot of capital expenditure. One of the studies that I do for the fabricators and manufacturers is their quarterly, if they call it the FFJSER, worst acronym in history, unpronounceable, the FIFISJSER. It's the Forming and Fabricating Job Shop Consumption Survey. One of the questions that we ask is what they are doing in terms of capital spending. And in previous years, we were seeing them kind of anticipate a recession with delaying those CapEx projects. They would not necessarily abandon them, but we would see them say, okay, what we were going to do in second quarter, we're pushing to third quarter. What we were going to do in third quarter, we may push to the next year altogether. Have not seen that in this quarter's iteration. Everyone is still saying we're going to do CapEx on schedule this quarter. We have to. We've got to bring in these machines. And you're seeing it with capacity utilization numbers too. The Fed collects these every month. And the idea behind the capacity utilization is that you want to be in this range around 80 to 85%. If you're under 80% utilization, you have too much slack. You've got machines that aren't working to their capacity. You have workers who aren't working to their capacity. So you want to be at least at 80%. When you get above 85%, now you're starting to run into bottlenecks. And so you don't want to be overtaxed. And when you get over 85%, that's when you start seeing companies buy more machinery, do more hiring, et cetera. We have been bouncing along at about 71, 72% for probably the last 3 or 4 years. So weak, but not catastrophic. We're about 10 points off where we should be. The very last reading for capacity utilization had it at 79.7. We are right at the edge of the lower bound of normal. So another good indication that there's no slack or very little slack in the system, not quite to the point that businesses feel like they are compelled to do a lot more buying, but they're not signals of an imminent recession. And frankly, even those who are calling for a recession are looking quite a ways ahead. There are very few that are predicting it this year. Most of the predictions, about half of the economists that have been polled, say second quarter of 2023, maybe third quarter. And one other point to make before we get too much deeper into this, economists, we are not very good at what we are supposed to be good at. We are supposed to be forecasters. We are supposed to be people that are telling you what's going to happen. Unfortunately, we're not terribly adept at this. One of the jokes that goes around of our economists is that we have predicted 13 of the last 3 recessions. We are often defined as people who explain tomorrow why the predictions we made yesterday didn't come true today. Forecasting is hard, there's a lot of variables, and getting out very far is very difficult. So when we start looking at what might happen a year from now, well, the reliability is not that great. What is really happening when an economist is predicting and forecasting is that we're warning more than we're forecasting. We're basically saying, if you don't deal with some of these problems, you are going to hit a wall. If you don't deal with the high price of energy, if you don't deal with the supply chain, if you don't deal with the labor shortage, if you don't deal with the federal deficit, if you don't deal with the debt, you're going to be in trouble. But there's time. You can do something. This is a year away. This is 2 years away. You can change things. You can find some way to deal with some of these issues, and then maybe you won't hit a recession. So it's kind of a forecast and warning, and you almost can see it when you ever see the charts. And this used to crack me up. You'd have a chart that's like an EKG, it just goes up and down and up and down and change and change. And then you get to the forecast part, and it's a perfectly straight line. And it's like, okay, it has not been a perfectly straight line for 100 years. Why would it suddenly become a perfectly straight line? Well, all it's doing at that point is saying, if you don't change anything, this is the track you'll take. But you will change things. Some things will change whether you want them to or not, and will affect that prediction. So just a little bit of a, I mean, we kind of already know that, but it's just kind of a reminder of the limitations of predictability and forecasting. So if you look at another indicator that has been getting a lot of attention of late, and this has been the inflation issue, consumer price index, and the like. Inflation's hard to measure, to be honest, and there are a number of different techniques that are in use at any given point. Consumer price index has the virtue of being current. It comes out every month. We'll be seeing a new one here in about a week. The problem with consumer price index is there's a certain artificiality to it. The way that this is computed is that the Commerce Department creates a basket of goods that the average family of four purchases. So you take that basket of goods and you add up what that costs, and then you add up what that costs the next month. And that tells you what inflation is, because if the prices went up between this month and that month, you've got inflation. If the prices went down, you don't, etc. The problem is that that basket of goods is somewhat artificial. It is not necessarily reflective of how the spending is actually taking place. We have 4 different generations spending right now, and they don't spend the same. Boomers don't spend like Gen Xers. Gen Xers don't spend like millennials. Millennials don't spend like Gen Z. So each one of these families of 4, assuming you even have a family of 4, is going to spend somewhat differently. A really good example is the impact of fuel costs. To a boomer or a Gen Xer, this is a major hit to their budget, because these are generations that drive a lot, and often they are the ones with larger vehicles. The Gen Z is kind of looking at everybody going, oh, dude, I don't even drive, man. I mean, I just Uber, and I bought a Prius, and most of the time I just bike to work because I decided to move to a loft that was 10 feet from where I work, or I work remotely. I don't care. The fuel prices aren't affecting me that much. I don't buy that much gas. Whatever, glad that it's not hurting me. So the inflation threat to a boomer is much higher than it is to the Gen Z, depending on how they're living their life, what their lifestyle is. So the CPI is a little bit erratic. And as a result, the Fed doesn't pay a lot of attention to it. When the Fed looks at inflation, it's paying attention to the PCE, which is the personal consumption expenditure. This is what people actually spent. Much more reliable, but it's slow. We'll get the new CPI in about a week. The PCE we don't get for a month or two, because you have to compute what people actually did. And so it lags. It's the old adage in data, which everybody is familiar with by now, that you can have it fast or you can have it accurate. You cannot have both, one or the other. And so the PCE is accurate, but not fast. CPI is fast, but not that accurate. And even within the CPI, you've got the notion of the core sticky and the core flexible. We're not seeing a lot of activity on the sticky side. I mean, those prices have stayed relatively stable. The inflation rate's not very high. Those that are moving, gas and food, are driving the current inflation threat. This creates a problem for the Fed, because the Fed has a pretty limited tool when it comes to controlling inflation. You're seeing all of this conversation at the higher levels of government and everything else. The Fed must do something. The Fed must raise rates. Well, yeah, that's one of the things the Fed is do is control inflation through the use of interest rates. But think about what this actually is. The Fed, excuse me, does not have the power to set interest rates for anything. I mean, they don't set prime, they don't set mortgage rates, they don't set consumer credit card rates, none of that. The rate that they control is the Fed funds rate, which is the rate that banks charge each other to make overnight loans. Every single day, banks make all kinds of decisions about loans, mortgage loans, commercial loans, whatever, and they make a commitment that usually exceeds the amount of money they have on hand. They are required by law to have money on hand or assets on hand to cover those decisions. So every night they go into the lending market with other banks and say, hey, I just did a whole bunch of loans today and I need a little more money. And they borrow it from a bank that has money to lend, and they borrow it at very, very low rates, the Fed funds rate. Then all the other rates basically follow from that. Don't have to, don't do it in lockstep. There's always going to be some difference between which bank reacts quickly, but eventually all the rates will react to that Fed funds rate. But the only thing that controls is money supply. The only thing that does is control the amount of lending that goes on in the economy. So it would be higher rates would affect the number of mortgages. It would affect the number of commercial loans. It would affect the amount of expansion. It would affect companies trying to finance mergers and acquisitions. So it basically pulls money out of the economy by making lending more costly. If the inflation is related to that money supply, this tool works. But if it isn't, the tool doesn't work. And this is the point the central banks keep making. The inflation right now is being driven by two things over which we have almost no control. Number one, fuel prices. Number two, the supply chain breakdown. So when you listen to the Fed or the European Central Bank or any of the others, they're saying, look, this isn't our job. This isn't what we're set up to do. We have no impact on what's going on with these issues because these are much more geopolitical in nature. So if you look at credit card use, I mean, this is another kind of indication of where overspending is going to make its first appearance. When you start seeing people use their credit cards to take care of very basic things, like when you start seeing people use their credit card to pay their rent or pay a mortgage or do things that should be part of a more normal budget, that's a signal that you're starting to get into a recessionary position. But we're not seeing that. People are still using their credit cards the way you're supposed to. They're using it for discretionary spending. They're using it for temporary spending. They're going to spend the credit card and then pay it off at the end of the month, etc. We're not seeing it in most parts of the country being used for necessities. Now, at the lower end of the income sector, that's not the case. You're beginning to see people at the lower end use their credit card or their credit, often not even a credit card, just other credit, to try to handle those day-to-day expenses. But it's not becoming pervasive in the economy as of yet. We're not seeing retail sales dive. Retail sales are still trending up. They're still on a path that we set way back in, geez, I don't know, going back a decade or longer, even adjusted for inflation. So we're still spending. We're still spending on a variety of things. We're kind of at that phase where we're complaining about inflation, but it's not changing our behavior much. To a certain degree, we're also kind of encouraging inflation because if you expect inflation to get worse, you will start to react appropriately. You will start to say, well, if the price of this is going to go up anyway, I might as well buy it now because it's only going to get more expensive. And that tends to feed inflation. It's one of the challenges of economics is that what's good for you is bad for the economy. I mean, it makes perfect sense for you to buy something now if you think it's going to get more expensive later. But by doing that, you encourage prices to keep going up. By the same token, if you think there's going to be a recession, you will start reacting appropriately, which means you will start to save more money. You will start to reduce your spending. You'll start to worry about your job security. All of those things will make sure that recession happens. I mean, what you should do from an economist's perspective, if you think recession is on its way, go spend like mad. Spend everything you have, stimulate the economy, let's go. But that's, of course, a really stupid thing to do if the economy tanks anyway, and you have spent all of your reserves. So right now, we're still spending at a pretty rapid clip. We've come down off the peak that we saw in 2021, but we're still performing. And 2021 was an incredibly unusual year. I don't want to go into a rehash of 2020 and 2021. We've been down that path before, but basically in 2020, we saw this traditional response to a recession. We saw money pouring out of the government in order to help the consumer cope and keep spending and presumably spend our way out of the recession. The problem was, and it really should have been recognized, but we were confused about a lot of what we were dealing with in 2020. We didn't have any place to spend it. So all of this money showed up. Service sector was closed down, restaurants closed, stores were closed, events were canceled, travel was curtailed. I mean, what were we supposed to spend that money on? We normally save at about a 6% rate nationally. Europe saves at twice that amount. Asia saves at about 3 times that amount. We're not a very good saving culture. So we didn't, and we didn't for many, many, many years. Suddenly in 2020, our savings rate jumped from 6% to 38%. We had no place to spend it, so we saved it. That money came pouring out in 2021. We thought we had defeated COVID. If you remember the beginning of 2021, all of the news was good. You know, the numbers were going down. We had a vaccine. All of the surveys that have been taken in 2020 indicated that people were going to get the vaccine at the very moment it was available. It was overwhelming, 90%. Then all of a sudden we had the vaccine and half the population decided they didn't want to get it. And it was like, what happened? And people, well, that's when they started putting microchips in my soup and I'm not going to take the vaccine. Well, that slowed down spending. We spent like crazy in the first maybe 2 quarters of 2021. At one point in the second quarter, we were growing at almost 9%. That slacked off as we got towards the end of the year. We now had Delta to deal with, we had Omicron to deal with, and we kind of reverted back to our behavior. But that spend is reflected in some of that retail burst, but it hasn't petered out completely. We're still spending at a fairly decent rate. Consumer credit is still basically in balance. It's still the proper percentage of disposable personal income. It's not yet a problem. If food and energy inflation continues, it could lead to a drop in consumer spending, but it hasn't yet. We're going to be looking really closely at basically the holiday season, because this is when peak retail occurs. We know that happens every year. The 2 or 3 moments that we'll really be watching, one will be Halloween. Halloween is now the second largest spending holiday in the US calendar. For 5 years in a row, adult costumes have outsold children's. It is now an adult holiday. It is now a decorating holiday. And it's kind of the announcement of the retail season to come. After Halloween, you get Black Friday, which is now better described as Blackvember. The entire month is full of sales and discounts because the retailers are trying to capture the early spenders, which are overwhelmingly women. So they get out there and they do the shopping soon. At the very end of the Christmas season, you get the phenomenon of the American male saving Christmas, and we do it the same way every year. We are convinced as men that Christmas will not be on the 25th of December, that it will be sometime in January, maybe March. We have plenty of time. We suddenly realize that, oh no, Christmas is on the 25th again, and we have 2 days to get whatever we're going to get for our loved ones. We have no idea where. This is not a joke. 50% of what men spend on the last 2 days before Christmas is spent in a convenience store. So if you have ever been the recipient of a 6-pack and a package of Slim Jims, you now know why. You've got a desperate male that couldn't find any place else to shop. So women end up with a bunch of junk they don't want, or if they have a more sort of with it male, they'll give them a gift card because they still don't know what they want, but they at least give them a gift card. What happens then is that there's this post-Christmas shopping extravaganza where the women who are slightly annoyed at having been given a useless gift or a credit card now go out and spend on average 2 to 3 times what the man spent on the original gift. Men saving Christmas. We do this every year. So we're going to be watching very closely to see what the retail environment is last 2 quarters of the year. And that will tell us if we really are headed for a 2023 downturn, recession. The Fed continues to assert that they think we're going to have a soft landing, that they'll raise rates a little bit, they'll do a little bit to control inflation, but that some of the other drivers will have begun to dissipate by that time. We'll see. We can only hope. The retail inventory to sales ratio is beginning to recover. It's still not where it needs to be. We want to be in that little orange box, preferably, where inventory matches up pretty closely with what we're seeing in terms of sales. We have had way too much inventory. Now we're dealing with too little inventory because of the supply chain breakdown, beginning to show some signs of recovery, but it won't completely recover until we get that supply chain chaos controlled one way or the other. Non-residential spending, getting into some of the construction stuff, that's not doing bad at all. I mean, construction is still growing at an 11.7% rate. Commercial construction is still up. It was down 44% as recently as 6 months ago and is now up around 8 or 9% growth. Manufacturing continues to be the fastest growing segment on a year-over-year basis, followed closely by commercial. What's been driving a lot of manufacturing is, again, predictable. It's warehousing. It's companies that are buying all this new inventory. They need a place to put it, so they're adding to their facility. But you're also seeing construction based on the robotic technology drive. And it's kind of funny. I mean, it's weird. Only, what can you say? The manufacturer may have been content for years having people work in some horrible cinder block building with no air conditioning, and I mean, it is what it is. Then they start bringing in robots and they start bringing in computers, and the robots and the computers essentially refuse to work properly in a hot, dirty environment. So the manufacturers have to upgrade their facilities to accommodate the robots. And the people that have been working there for years are like, are you kidding me? You made me work in this hellhole for 20 years and you have to upgrade because the robots don't like it. I keep telling people the robot apocalypse has occurred, but no one believes me. But there's an example right there. They're taking over the world. So we're seeing a lot of manufacturing expansion. We're also going to see a lot that's driven by logistics and supply chain. We haven't talked about reshoring. I think I talked about it at the last session that we did, but it's still going on. There's about $1 trillion worth of reshoring thus far this year. Companies moving operations back from China, from Asia in general. A lot of diversification as well, where people are moving out of China, but they're moving to other Asian countries like Vietnam or Thailand or Taiwan. So you're still seeing a lot of warehouse and logistics development. Amazon has slowed down a bit, but when you look at what Amazon is actually doing, they threw up an awful lot of warehouse activity early on as they kind of tried to figure out where the demand was strongest. And so what they're doing now is consolidating, and they're expanding those areas that have seen a lot of business and contracting those that have seen less. So they're really not reducing their amount of activity. They're just being a little more strategic about where this is going to take place. So, yep, going the wrong direction here. There we go. New home sales data, a little bit less encouraging. And we're trying to kind of get a read for what's happening in the housing market. housing prices have been very, very high and were sustainable as long as mortgage rates were low. Mortgage rates are still not ridiculously high, but they're about double what they were. I mean, they're in the sixes now as opposed to the threes and fours. This is not yet really affecting a lot of home sales. Most of what's been causing the decline in home sales was that people who were on the fence about buying went ahead and made the decision when they thought that mortgage rates were going to start going up. So you kind of took care of those that were really in the market, and now you're seeing a little bit of a slump. What's likely to happen with home sales going forward is something that's been noted almost by the remodelers more than anybody else. The bargains now are going to be in the inner ring suburbs, where cities have kind of moved on to the outer ring, the exurban suburbs, but where the boomers used to live in the inner ring, those houses are now coming up for sale because the boomers have left them, did not leave them to their children. They moved to senior living or assisted living or apartments or just a new home. So that inner ring is now getting a lot of attention, and the remodelers are seeing a great deal of work in that sector. So you're beginning to see sort of an existing home resurgence that is countering some of that new home decline. I don't think we're going to see the kind of housing bubble burst that some have been predicting, because we've got some different dynamics going on right now in housing. What often created the bubble is that you would have a community that would grow so fast that it would overwhelm its ability to employ the new entrants. And you look at places like Austin and Nashville and even Dallas, where so many people are moving in per day. I was talking to a city manager in Austin, and I said, "You're getting 200 people a day moving to Austin?" "Yep." "Do you really have that many jobs for that many people?" He goes, "Nope, don't need them. These people are moving to Austin and they already have a job. They are working remotely for some company somewhere else in the country." He gave me the example of a couple that had just moved to Austin, just bought a house, everything was great. Their company, the one they work for, is in Duluth, Minnesota. The company in Duluth said, "You have a choice. Most of what you can do remotely. So you can work remotely from anywhere you want and arrange to be in Duluth about once a month, or you can move to Duluth." And this couple said, "Gee, Duluth or Austin? Let me think about that for 8/10 of a second. Yeah, I'm going to move to Austin and I'll show up in Duluth once a month." The Commerce, or the Chamber of Commerce in Des Moines, now considers Des Moines a suburb of Chicago. There are so many people that work remotely for companies in Chicago and just simply said, "Look, the prices are ridiculous in Chicago. I don't want to live there. It's too much of a hassle. Traffic is terrible. It's amazing what I can get for the same money in Iowa. So I only have to be in the office a couple times a month maybe and come in for meetings, and the rest of the stuff I could do remotely." That's changing the dynamics in cities. They can now get much larger than their employment base would indicate, because so many of the people that live there don't work there. And therefore it's expandable in ways that it would not have been previously. A few other construction insights that is going to matter for this industry and a lot of others. The amount of attention being spent on data centers is just staggering. This is not a misprint. 73,000 small and medium-sized data centers needed in the next 2 years. It's just, I mean, Zoom doubles its capacity twice a day. It has to. I mean, you just see what we've become as far as remote work and Zoom meetings. Even people that are back in the office are doing Zoom meetings rather than go to a meeting room. Warehouses are being packed full. The warehouse development pattern is still well underway. Logistics is still driving a lot of this. On the healthcare side, it's a little bleaker because the hospitals didn't make a lot of money during COVID. The biggest money makers for hospitals are elective surgeries, and elective surgeries virtually vanished during the COVID years. People were not interested in going to the hospitals. The hospitals didn't have the capacity. COVID ended up really decimating the staffs of hospitals. Doctors quit, nurses quit, support people quit. They've had a very hard time getting those numbers back up, and labor costs have gotten a lot higher. So hospital expansion, which had been booming for about 20 years, for the most obvious of reasons, what is the generation that needs the most medical care? It's boomers, and the boomers were really driving the expansion of medical care. That now has kind of come to an end. Manufacturing, as I mentioned, is still growing like crazy. And then you've got the issue of what states are going to do with their surpluses. This is likely to be kind of a red-blue state differentiation. The blue states thus far are talking more about using the surplus to provide aid for households that are under pressure from inflation and recession. The red states are still orienting towards projects. They still want to finish transportation projects. They still want to work on development issues. They still are looking at expanding educational facilities. So there's been kind of a differentiation depending on the politics of a particular state. We are running out of diesel, and the reason we're running out of diesel is relatively simple. We are shipping a lot of it to Europe. We are in the position now of trying to make a dent in the deficit that Europe has developed when it comes to fuel. We have seen a huge increase in the export of diesel and LNG into Europe to make up for the fact that natural gas prices in Europe jumped by over 1,000%. And they're not going to be able to hang in there on things like sanctions for a whole lot longer. So we're basically looking at diesel prices that are above $10 a gallon, which is considerably higher than it was even a year or so ago. And this is another one of those geopolitical things. We all know why we're dealing with high fuel prices. There's no mystery to this, even though you'll hear commentary that just kind of just baffles me. Or I don't understand why gas prices are so high. It's like, wow, have you been living in a cave? The United States is the world's largest oil producer. We account for about 15% of the total crude oil produced in the world. Russia is number 2. They're responsible for about 13% of the crude oil produced in the world. Saudi Arabia is number 3. They're at about 12%. So when you yank 13% of the world's crude oil off the market, you're going to have a reaction. You cannot not have a reaction. So Russia is still producing. It's still there. They're now trying to cut back on production because they don't have any place to store it. But it's basically isolated in Russia. There are a few countries that are buying Russian oil, most notably China and India. But neither one of those countries are paying world prices. The Chinese said, look, if you think we're going to buy your oil at 120 bucks a barrel, you don't know us very well. You can't sell your oil, can you? You can only sell it to countries like us. Therefore, you will sell it to us at $40 a barrel, not 120, 40. And India has done the same. They're making the Russians sell it to them for $60 a barrel. So the Russians are still producing, still making a little bit of money off oil, but not like they did. And it has reverberated through the oil market. But the fact that this is locked up in Russia is what has stymied the oil producers. The US has maximized production. We will be producing 13 million barrels of oil a day starting within about a month or two. We will certainly be doing that all the way through 2023. That's more than we've ever produced. And we are very definitely at the top end of our production. But if the oil companies are to further expand, and they have been asked to do so, they say, well, okay, here's the deal. If we do more, it's going to take 8, 9, 12, 14 months before this comes to market. It's not like we can just turn on a tap. What happens if this Ukraine situation resolves in that period of time? Suddenly, all of that Russian oil comes on the market, and the price per barrel could conceivably drop anywhere between $40 and $60 a barrel. that's a significant decline. That takes things from 120, 110 down to perhaps 60, 70, and that's a lot less. So the oil companies are basically saying, look, we're not going to go overboard in overproduction because this could come back to bite us. Consumption in the US has declined. I mean, right now we're producing or will be producing 13 million barrels a day. We consume about 20 million barrels a day. As recently as 2 years ago, we were consuming 24 million barrels a day. So what happened to that 4 million barrel a day consumption? Well, that's remote work. People were not commuting. So the oil companies are basically saying, look, demand is actually down somewhat. And if prices continue to stay high for a while, it'll further decline because people will drive less because the prices are high. So you kind of get a feel for what kind of is going through the minds of all of this stuff. And there's geopolitics involved with this too. As you're probably aware, Biden was visiting with the Saudi Arabians ostensibly to try to get them to produce more, but really it was more warning Saudi Arabia that they're not the only game in town. The new player for the US is the UAE. The United Arab Emirates has a new leader, new sheikh, who is more pro-American. He was educated here, he's worked in the US, much more pro-US and much more modern. This is where Dubai is. And if you want to feel for how different Dubai and the UAE is from the rest of the Arab world, tune in this fall to the Housewives of Dubai. You have seen ostentatious spending before, nothing like you're going to see now. And the UAE is a lot more influential in the Gulf states than they used to be. I mean, they're all looking at the UAE saying, wow, we'd much rather be like you guys and filthy, filthy rich as opposed to those fundamentalists in Saudi Arabia. And we're sort of sidling along saying, you know, Saudi, we could put a lot more emphasis into UAE and a lot less on you. And the UAE can get the rest of the Gulf states to be producing just about as much as the Saudis do. So you're seeing a lot of this kind of geopolitical jockeying going on at very high levels. So forecast for this year, somewhere around $100. Some people are taking it fairly low. Some are pushing it up close to 120. Good indication of the fact that nobody really knows what to expect as far as prices. Dollar is still strong. Everything that is denominated in dollars is I mean, the imports are still pouring in. We are not doing as well on the export side because the dollar is strong. But if you are bringing in product from overseas, this is essentially good news. The dollar is continuing to buy more of what is being imported than would have been the case before. We have the Gray Swan issues in China, which is related to what they're doing with COVID. And again, not to go into a geopolitical rant, but there are some big changes that are beginning to occur in China. And without going into gory detail, back when Xi Jinping was becoming the leader of China, he was not the anointed one. When Jiabao or when Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were stepping down in China, they anointed a different guy as their proposed successor. They pointed at Li Keqiang. And Li Keqiang was odds on to become the next head of China. But at that precise moment, he had gotten caught up tangentially in a bit of a scandal that was affecting the number 3 man in China, Bo Xilai. Bo Xilai out in Western China had gotten all mixed up with corruption and ended up becoming a scapegoat and was kicked out of the party, was put in prison. His wife was executed. Lee was not really involved in any of that, but he was just close enough to Bo that his star faded enough for Xi to advance and become the head of China. Lee has never stopped wanting to be the head of China. He is currently the premier, and he is right now extremely active criticizing Xi in public in official publications, basically saying, look, you are ruining the Chinese economy. All of this attack on the United States, have you forgotten that the US is the one that buys all our stuff? Why are you continuing to punch our biggest customer in the mouth? Li is a disciple of Deng Xiaoping. He is somebody that bought into the get rich is glorious mantra that came out under Deng. He now is also criticizing Xi over the COVID policy and saying this is ridiculous. We are losing our economic growth patterns. We are shutting down whole operations, 355 ships backed up off the coast of Shanghai again already. Talked to a guy who's got an operation in China. They were told they could resume production, but here were their new rules. Anybody that showed up for work would not be allowed to leave. They had to live in the factory. They couldn't go home. And the guy said, "Are you kidding me? We don't have showers. We don't have any place for them to sleep." 90% of his employees quit that day. They're like, "I'm not going to live in the factory. What is wrong with you?" Truckers that were coming into that place, if they delivered or picked up at that place, they had to then go through a 3-week quarantine. So he said the only trucker that came anywhere near the plant dropped our load 7 miles away from our facility and said, "You can go pick it up." I mean, it's absurd. I mean, China is not, can't sustain this for a lot longer. And Li is making that point. So it's not like there's going to be an imminent coup. But just remember that 8 people run that country. It's the Politburo. And if 5 of them decide that Xi is not working out, he leaves and Li takes over, or Li basically begins to exert himself more. I mean, it's the geopolitics of this gets more and more intriguing with every passing day. I've showed you this before. This is the thing that Armada does, tracking manufacturing, and it hasn't changed a lot from the last time that we showed you, except that we're now showing the peak just about at its max now, starts to trail off, but then recovers and begins to come back to life in 2023. Historically, you can see that this is a distinct decline, but it only takes us back to where we were 2017, 2018. So it's not catastrophic. It's not recessionary by any stretch. It's not where we were, obviously, in 2020, and it wasn't where we were in 2008 either. So it's significant, but not critical at this stage. We're also dealing with the infrastructure spending. Most of this is front loaded. It's going to be the first couple of years. Right now, the majority of it is being spent on traditional stuff, infrastructure with roads, airports, bridges, things of that nature. The more exotic stuff begins to show this summer and into the fall, where you'll begin to see more public transit attention, more rural broadband discussion, more attention to climate change type issues. But those have become very controversial all of a sudden because we're now understanding how difficult it is to transition from fossil fuel to alternatives. The weakness with alternatives is that they're not on-demand energy sources, something that Europe is learning to its chagrin this year. The Europeans, particularly the Germans, invested heavily in wind power. They thought this would be a way to reduce their dependence on Russian gas. And it would have been if the wind had blown this year, but it hasn't. They're only getting about 20% of what they expected to get from wind power because it's been a wind calm year. That's the problem with most of the alternatives. You can't turn them on and off. If you need more power from a coal plant, you burn more coal. If you need more power from a gas plant, you burn more gas. If you need more power from an oil plant, you burn more oil. You need more power from wind. Okay, get windy now. Come on, let's go. You're at the mercy of what nature has in mind. What is going to be the secret to alternatives, whether it's wind or solar or geothermal or anything else, will be battery technology. The ability to store when you can. I'm from the state of Kansas. Kansas invested a lot of money in wind as well because it's a very windy state. The challenge is that the windiest part of the year for Kansas is spring, when we don't need the power. Temperatures are benign, everything is fine, blowing like crazy. When the summer comes, July and August, when we really need the power because we're cranking air conditioning up as much as we can, no wind. So what the discussion is all about is how do we develop batteries that can store this stuff long enough that we can be frugal and we can say, look, we're going to store it when it's windy and use it when it's not, etc. So that's a whole nother discussion at some point, but more attention will get paid to that towards the end of this year and into next. So with that, I'm going to wind things up. I'm down to my last 5 minutes. I started with a Kissinger quote, so I thought I'd end with one. There cannot be a crisis next week. My schedule is already full. So that's kind of how I feel these days. Those of you who are gluttons for this kind of stuff, we are, if nothing else, verbose. I'm just as long-winded in print as I am in public. You're already getting some of my wit and wisdom from the AWFS. Adria has been helping distribute this for quite a while. So if you want more, God knows there's more. Just let me know. We can put you on the list. If you want to see the strategic intelligence system on the manufacturing side, it's available for a trial as well. So with that, I'm going to take time for questions. I think Adria is going to field some of those for me. And then we'll leave you to be and do whatever you want to do the rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Chris. As always, so much fantastic information. And I always appreciate the they almost seem like random tidbits, but they all come in together and tell a good story about where we're at. We did have one question. You mentioned Russia accounts for 13% of the world's crude oil. What percent did the U.S. rely on from Russia prior to their war? Biden administration. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and finish.
Biden administration stopped drilling, shut down the Keystone pipeline, and forced U.S. to rely on crude from overseas. Our oil costs would be dramatically less had this administration not made the decisions they made.
Yeah, a couple of interesting points on that. And one is, and it always makes me laugh, the Keystone controversy. The Keystone pipeline was a big deal a few years back, and the ostensible argument at the time was that environmentalists had shut down the Keystone over concern for the sandhill crane in Nebraska, and this was seen as a environmental issue. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from Kansas, and I'm right below Nebraska, and I'm like, the only thing that matters in Nebraska is Husker football. You know, if they'd ever heard of the sandhill crane, it'd be, can you shoot it and eat it? It's not the Berkeley of the Plains. I mean, this is not a particularly liberal state. So what really was going on? And a friend of mine at the Omaha Herald had the same question. He said, look, the grassroots group that's fighting this pipeline has a staff of 12, and they have one of the most expensive offices in Omaha. That's not normal. So he looked it up, and sure enough, all of the money that was being used to fight the pipeline was coming from the railroads. Omaha is the headquarters of Union Pacific, and BNSF is owned by Warren Buffett from Omaha. The rail wanted a couple of years to build their infrastructure and take that shipment out of the Dakotas and Canada rather than the pipeline. And the oil producers would rather use rail because then they can send it anywhere they want. They can send it to New Jersey, California, Louisiana. You put it in a pipeline, it goes to Cushing, Oklahoma, and it gets mixed with everybody else's oil, and you lose price control. So this was really a battle of conveyances. You know, I'm a fairly conservative economist, and my motto has always been follow the money. If you want to know why something is happening, who gets rich and who's not getting rich. When the Biden administration made a decision about not allowing the drilling on federal land, the oil sector just kind of looked at him like, who cares? We don't go there anyway. It's more expensive. It's much more cost efficient for us to drill on private land, and we've got plenty of opportunities to do that. We've been increasing our production, and when we import from other parts of the world, it's rare, mostly convenience. You know, we get most of our, we've got like a 7 million barrel a day deficit that we have to account for. We consume 20 million, we produce 13. Most of that comes from Canada. Some of it comes from Mexico. The New Jersey refineries still find it simpler to bring oil in from the Middle East by tanker than to try to get it from the middle of the country, because there's only one reliable pipeline that goes from the Midwest to the East Coast, and that's the Colonial. if there is a pipeline conversation, and there is, it's not the Keystone, it's the Colonial. It's trying to figure out a way to either expand that pipeline or build another one that would come from the middle of the country to the East Coast. We don't have any trouble at all getting oil from the north. I mean, that's plenty of opportunities to get oil from the Dakotas, from Texas. It's getting it, the finished product, and the crude oil out to the East Coast refineries. And right now, they find it cheaper to buy it from North Africa or the Middle East. So we have achieved fairly close to oil independence. Like I said, we still have a deficit to deal with, but it's much less than it used to be. As recently as 2006, we imported 65% of the crude that we needed. We import very little now, and we import none from Russia. We haven't for years. The only thing we get from Russia, and that was limited, was an additive that we used to put into the North Dakota oil that made it a little more acceptable to refiners. But we can also get that additive from other places, including Texas.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have 3 really good questions, and I know we're at time, so maybe we can do rapid fire before
Sure.
we wrap up. So the first one is, where is the battery tech coming from? We're not waiting on Duracell, are we?
No, it's the bunny. We're waiting on the bunny.
Uh-oh.
No, there's a lot of pretty interesting battery advancement going on. I was at a conference about a year ago, and several of the larger companies that have engaged in this are getting very close to having massive batteries that can hold power for months. So we're not that far off. The names are escaping me at the moment, but if you send me an email and say, hey, who's doing the battery stuff, I'll be more than happy to look it up and send it.
All right. Let's see. The next one was, is there any hope that the war in Ukraine will end before the end of the year?
It's very possible because, Russia has done this before, and frankly, so have we. I mean, both of Russia and the United States just finally looked at Afghanistan and said, this is hopeless. And the Russians just pulled out and said, okay, we accomplished what we set out to accomplish, we're leaving. And at one point, they may decide to do that with Ukraine. Nothing has worked out the way Putin thought it would, and it's been costing his country dearly. So there may very well be a point where it said, look, all we want to do is keep Ukraine out of NATO and make Eastern Ukraine safe for Russians. We're done. We're leaving. We did the same thing in Afghanistan. We were there for 20 years. We finally said, okay, we won. We're leaving. Goodbye. You didn't do anything. Yeah, we did. Never mind. I mean, every time I think of this, I think of that character in Ally McBeal, bygones, and just move on.
Oh, I forgot about that show. All right, last one. Do you see the microchip manufacturers ultimately building in the US?
Yes, they are right now. There's a huge Intel plant going up in Ohio. There's another one planned for Arizona, and there's another one planned for upstate New York. What's finally kind of tripping it for the microchip producers is that you need an awful lot of investment. And if it's left just to the private sector, it's too much. Japan and Taiwan began to develop a lot of microchip capability because the government backed it to a degree. And what we're seeing now is the government here backing those efforts. And a lot of that money is likely to come from the Defense Department because we're looking at this as a national security issue, as we should. We talk about the microchips and the silicon chips going into cars. Be aware that each and every Patriot missile has over 120 chips in it. And every time we use one, we blow up all those chips. So we still need a lot to basically feed our military. So yeah, we're getting around to, we used to produce almost 70% of the chips that we use, and then we let them kind of offshore, and now we're bringing it back.
Okay, I said that was the last one, but another really good one came in. So, oh my gosh, I'm sorry everyone, we're over time, but if you're still here, then you're into it. Do you see lumber prices going back to pre-pandemic levels anytime soon?
Those will probably lag. They are going to go back to pre-pandemic levels, but a lot of it's going to be dependent on kind of the residential housing demand, because what's been keeping the prices high is one, shortage of the raw material itself, and the fact that you've had such steady demand from home building. That will begin to slack off. New home building is beginning to decline. So you will probably see some relief, maybe towards the end of the year, but certainly towards the beginning of next.
Well, that's good to hear. Okay, well, thank you, thank you. We'll let you off the hook now, Dr.
All
Kuehl.
right.
We appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you found this super informative and helpful. If you have a moment, please complete the survey. It's really helpful for us to hear your feedback, and reach out to me if you have any questions or comments or anything else. And we thank you for being with us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Very good. Thanks.
Take care.